Hello, biology students. Let's do our new unit, DNA, proteins, and biotechnology. We're going to start with DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. We're pretty familiar with it, but we got to know it in extra detail now. Let's jump in. Well, first we got to review macromolecules. Nucleic acids is the macromolecule category for DNA. And its building block, is called the nucleotide. All right, remember, monomers are the building blocks of macromolecules or polymers. And so the building block that makes up DNA is nucleotide. This is usually pretty easy to remember because a nucleic acid sounds like a nucleotide. It's a tidbit or a little piece of a nucleic acid. We're going to learn about this nucleotide in detail now. There's actually three major parts to a nucleotide, this building block or Lego piece that makes up DNA. It has a nitrogen base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. Yes, the same type of phosphate group we've been talking about when we learned ATP. All right, how will you remember all three? Well, usually students remember by looking and labeling a visual. So let's make sure you label your visual in your notes, all right? So there's a visual, make sure you put the words on the visual. So a nitrogen base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. Those nitrogen bases have four major types, all right? So even though there were those three parts, there's four types of nitrogen bases that can be in a nucleotide. Adenine, which we'll call A, cytosine, which we'll call C, thymine, which we'll call T, and guanine, which we'll call G. You do need to know what the base big word is, but normally we're going to call them by these letters. Okay? The structure of DNA, right, is where the nucleotide, sugars, and phosphates are on the outer part of a ladder shape. All right, we see sugar and phosphate alternating right on the outside of this kind of ladder-looking shape. And the nitrogen bases, those A's, T's, C's, and G's, they're on the inside. We're going to practice this in class. But keep in mind that DNA, even though it's shaped like a ladder, in reality it's pretty twisted. And that twisted shape we call a double helix. But we still can think of it if we unwind it as a ladder shape, where those outside parts that look like a ribbon here are the sugars and phosphates, and the inside part we pay most attention to usually are those nitrogen bases, A's, T's, C's, and G's, because that's how we read DNA. Now here's the really important part that we really have to practice here and in class and outside of class, the base pairing rules. Those nitrogen bases like to be with specific other nitrogen bases. And the way they pair is called complementary base pairs. Just like in art class, there's certain colors that like to go together really well, right? Green is right across from red, and that's why they go really well together. They're complementary. Well, A always likes to go across from T. They complement each other, and they base pair together. A goes with T. G likes to always go with C. They love being across from each other on that ladder. So that's really important, so important that we have to memorize it and practice, and it's going to be one of those things that you almost never forget about biology. So you have to have a saying in your head, whether it's A goes with T, C goes with G, or this lady's going to come after you. She's pretty scary looking, right? You have to memorize it. I'm not joking. There's really no way around it. So if that like kind of boring saying doesn't work, we'll come up with a saying with other words. Apples are in trees and cars are in garages. That's a way you could also remember which one goes with which. But you have to remember. All right? So what holds those bases together? Well, interestingly enough, it's hydrogen bonds. Just like the things that are in between water molecules when water is sticky, there's hydrogen bonds holding that DNA ladder structure together. So here's the nitrogen bases. And what again was on the outside? Oh yes, the sugars and the phosphates. And when we twist this ladder up, we call it a double helix. So there's different terms to describe DNA. that we have to know before we move on. Sometimes DNA, when it's really the long DNA structure and we see it like an X, is called a chromosome. Sometimes we refer to DNA as chromatin when it's stringy. And sometimes we're only going to talk about a specific chunk of that big X chromosome, and that's called a gene. And the gene makes a single protein. We'll be practicing these 3 last words a lot over this second half of the year, but they are pretty confusing, so we got to get them straight. Great job, guys. That's the end. We're going to do a lot more on DNA in class. See you then.